Hi, in this video we'll look at how to set up SQL Server High Availability Group in SQL 2017. So this visual diagram illustrates the different elements involved in this setup. So we're going to be building a two-node high availability group Windows SQL Server setup. So one thing to note is the same thing can be built in Linux as well, but we will be looking at that as well, but not in this video. But SQL 2017 has a new feature that basically allows you to build the high availability group in a Windows failover cluster service, or in a Linux using pacemaker to detect the node availability, and you can also use to build use something called external, where you can just build a secondary node for just read-only copy, not for failover. So we'll briefly look at those options, but today we'll be looking at building the high availability group using the Windows failover cluster service. So here we have two nodes which are running at Windows 2012 data center edition, and we have SQL 2017 installed on these. These are default instances on both the nodes, and which I already did. So I already installed the SQL 2017 instances on both of them, and these are the assigned IP addresses to these nodes. And the setup that we'll be using today is a synchronous commit and automatic failover. So the one will be acting as the primary database, and the other one will be as a secondary database. It can be used for read-only copy as well. So the synchronous commit basically makes sure that the transaction from node, so any transaction will actually commit on both the instances before it's being considered as a successful transaction. And the automatic failover has a new option called database level health detection, which they introduced in SQL 2016. Basically, it detects the database availability in terms of, it checks, for example, the IO or the disk availability. So if a particular disk goes down, or that means if the database actually is not functional at any point of time, it actually detects that, and it fails over the entire database, the high availability group, and all the databases that are included in that high availability group to the secondary node. So if you have multiple high availability groups and you have different databases configured in them, so if a particular disk failures, so only the databases or a database affected by that high availability group will only be failed over. So that's called database level health detection. So it's a new feature they introduced, and it's pretty. Microsoft actually recommends that feature going forward. And coming here, so we'll be using Windows Failover Clustering Service, this is the DNS entry name as well as the IP address, and we will be also using an high availability group listener, which is used as a driver for the clients to be able to connect to the primary or the read-only database based on the options they use during the connection process. Basically, it routes the request either to the primary or the secondary database, based on the request type or based on the availability of the database. So if you're looking at a primary database, and if a database goes down, the current request might fail, but the new incoming request will automatically go to the secondary node available, which will act as a primary database. So normally you will see the minimum is a 2 node, but you can add multiple nodes based on your requirements. So these are all the IP addresses that will be used today, and as well as the DNS names that are already set up, and we will be using an Active Directory server to be able to build the Windows Failover Clustering services, as well as the other functionality that we will be using today. So let's go and look at the install setup process briefly. So like I mentioned before, so we'll be using 2 SQL instances on different nodes of the domain network. So this is already done. So I installed the SQL servers on both the nodes. I would say these are the kind of like a prerequisites depending upon your environment. The first thing is make sure you enable the IP4 protocol in the TCP/IP parameters in the network configuration. So basically, you need to make sure that if you go to the the network configurations for the protocol, so if you go to properties and if you go to IP addresses, make sure the IPv4 version is enabled, or make sure all the IPs IP versions are enabled. So IP2, for example, here we need to make sure this particular IP is actually enabled and active on particular port. So make sure once you change the restart the SQL Server service. And the second thing is, make sure you for this, since this is a lab setup, so I had disabled the domain firewall, or you can actually make sure you provision the inbound and outbound roles for ports 1433 and 5022. 1433 is a TCP IP connection endpoint, but 5022 is the database mirroring endpoint. So we need to make sure these are excluded from the firewall. If not, then you will be having a lot of difficulty setting it up. The third one is making sure you use a SQL domain, a Windows domain account for the SQL service, for the SQL service account. So if I look at the SQL Server service here on one of the node, you can see that I'm using a SQL Junkie is my domain name, and the SQL admin is actually the domain account. So make sure you're using a domain account, because a lot of the times when you're setting up the high availability, the account that SQL Server runs, it doesn't need to be a same domain account on all the nodes. It has to be a domain account, because you can use a network account, but basically you need to provision, or you need to provide access to that network account for the mirroring endpoint that it is also trying to access on the other node, because the database mirroring, you are sending the data from one node to other node. So the SQL Server need to have access to the mirroring endpoint of the other node to be able to send the data. The second step is we'll install the failover clustering role, and then we'll set up the Windows failover cluster for both the nodes. And we'll make sure the cluster computer account has full permissions to the AD computer object. So this is kind of an important requirement. We need to make sure that the cluster computer network account has full permissions to the AD computer object, which I will be showing you how to do that. And the fourth and final step is we'll enable the SQL high availability group. And we'll make sure on both instance levels on both the nodes, and then we'll set up the HA groups and we'll make sure we set up the listener, and we'll make sure the second node joins the HA group, and we can simulate a simple failover to make sure it works. So so these are all the the computer names as well as the and the IPs that we'll be using here. So these are the two nodes. So let's go ahead and start the setup. So since I already completed the step 1, I'll start from the step 2. So let's go ahead and install the failover clustering role. So these are my two nodes here. So the first step is I'll make sure I'll install the failover clustering role. So go to Server Manager, and go to Add Roles and Features. Click Next, Roles and Features. Click Next, select the server, click Next, and select Failover Clustering, and make sure we add all the tools as well that are required. Add features, click Next, and go ahead and install. So we'll repeat the same process on the second node. Go to Server Manager, click Manage, Add Roles or Features, click Next, Role Based or Features Based Installation. So we are on the second node, so we are installing the Failover Clustering Manager, Failover Clustering feature on both the nodes. So click Next, and then we'll go ahead and select the Failover Clustering, Add Features, click Next, Install. So normally this does not take a lot of time. This should finish pretty quickly. So we'll make sure we'll make sure both the nodes are complete. They complete before we start the next step. So while the the installation is in progress, we can go ahead and what I want to show is the new feature that was introduced in SQL 2017. So this is the cluster type. So when you create an availability group, you specify what is your cluster type. So the one we are installing today is a Windows failover, Windows failover cluster service, Windows Server failover cluster. So this is the default cluster type. The second one is external. So Windows failover cluster basically makes sure that the nodes are available, and it always makes sure that it checks the nodes. It makes sure the voting is done based on the if a particular node has down, so it checks the node vote and makes sure it lets the SQL server know which node to be failed over if a particular node is completely down. And an external cluster manager is like something that is not Windows. For example, on Linux, which can use a pacemaker, or depending upon the distribution type, a particular feature may not be a Windows Server failover cluster. So it uses that part of the feature of a Linux or Unix machine to be able to detect the node availability. And the third one is the none. Basically, we will not be setting up the high availability, or basically we'll be setting the high availability group, but it will not be used as a failover. So it only be used as a read-only database copy, so just for read-only availability. So back to the installation, let's check the so we have finished the installation here. So let's check both the nodes. Okay, so the failover clustering is actually installed. So what we'll do is we'll go to the one of the nodes. Okay, and we'll launch the failover clustering manager. So here we'll launch the failover clustering manager. So what we'll do now is we'll actually set up the failover cluster on both the machines. So we're going to create a cluster. When I say failover cluster, it's actually Windows Server failover cluster. It's not the SQL failover cluster instance. So in this case, that's a different kind of mode that we can set up. But today we will be just looking at the Windows Server failover cluster service. So click next, and basically we'll go ahead and add the nodes here. So we added both the nodes here. We click next. So basically, depending upon the number of nodes, you can add multiple nodes or servers to be able to part of this Windows Server failover cluster. So we'll not run the configuration tests. So cluster name. So we'll be using the so this is our cluster name, and this is our IP address. So it's this is to just confirm that the cluster is being installed. So normally this cluster creation process, you have to do it on one of the node. So normally it actually sets up everything on the second node as well. So let's go and click next. So the cluster creation process is completed, so we can see here, and we'll click finish. So right now we need to make sure that we are not using any quorum disks or witness disks or any cloud witness. So we'll come back to this process in the later time, but today we're going to just build a basic Windows failover cluster service for our high availability group. we'll click finished. So we can confirm this visually by going over to the the cluster manager or refreshing the cluster manager plugin in the Windows manager. So we can refresh here. This is our cluster, and we can look at the nodes. So these are two nodes are actually up. So I'm on one of the node here, so I'm able to look at both the nodes and making sure that they're available. And so all right, so the next step is actually enable the failover. Next step is actually make sure enable the high availability group on both the nodes. So that's probably done in the the SQL Server service level, instance level itself. So let's go to the I'm on the one of the node here. So I'll go to the SQL Server configuration manager, and I'll go to properties, and I'll go to always on high availability, and I'll make sure I enable the always on availability group. So click apply, click OK, and then go ahead and restart the SQL Server service to make sure that the configuration change is applied. And we'll repeat the same process on the node 2. Properties, availability, enable, apply, click OK, and go ahead and restart. So before we go ahead, one of the important step is actually make sure we give the cluster computer account full permission to the AD computer object. So what this means is that let's navigate to the AD controller. So this is this is our Active Directory domain controller, and I will be using this as the control point for both the nodes. Normally in a typical environment you will not be doing this, but this is, since this is a lab setup to minimize the resource utilization, I'm using my AD domain controller for multiple things here. So let's go to the event manager and go to the Active Directory users and computers. So in this basically this is our cluster computer AD object, right? SQL CL03. Basically what we do is first thing is we make sure we have advanced features enabled to view here. So let's go ahead and click properties and go to security. Here we click add, and here we make sure we select the computer as the object type. Okay, and then we specify the cluster computer account, which is the network account of the cluster. Check name, check names, SQL CL03, check names. So it detected the network account. So basically it's the cluster computer for the failover cluster, but has a network account which actually used between the two nodes to be able to communicate. So we need to make sure, and the same network account is actually used to create the AG listener, high availability group listener. So this is important to be able to configure it correctly. So let's go ahead and click OK. So this is if this is the domain, SQL CL03 is actually the network account for the cluster. So we'll make sure this has full control, and so basically we are only giving to the actual cluster computer name only. We are not giving to the entire Active Directory. So just make sure, click OK, and that completes all our prerequisites or all the requirements that we need to do to set up the HA. So let's now go ahead and actually set up the high availability groups. So these are the two SQL instances right now. They don't have any databases on them. So first thing we'll do is we'll just create a simple database here for our high availability group. So we'll create a database called test. Click OK, and so we'll go ahead and set up the high availability group. So right now I did not create the database on the second node. So we'll have the high availability setup actually create the secondary database during the join process. So I'll show you that. So let's launch the new high availability group wizard. So we'll set up the SQL HA03. So this is the feature that I was talking about, the database level health detection. Today, I mean, in today's setup, I will not be enabling it, but this basically it's just a feature that to check the database resources, for example, disks that are on the underlying disks for this database are available. So that if there are issues with the disk, the database failover process begins, or any databases that are included in that availability group as well are failed over to the second node or whatever the second replica setup that is in that particular high availability group. So we'll click next. So first thing is that before to be part of the because we just created the database, a full backup is actually required to be part of the high availability group. So here it's one of the prerequisites, and we can see here it says full backup is required. So let's go ahead and take a backup of the database. Task full, click media options, make sure overwrite, click OK. So the test backup is completed. So here we refresh, and it now says meets prerequisites. So we'll check the database here and we'll click next. So in this case here we will be going ahead and adding our second replica. Add replica, connect, and then we can see here are the options for the high availability group. So we will be setting up the automatic failover. So it supports up to 3 nodes. When you select the automatic failover, it automatically select the synchronous commit. So the transactions commit on both the nodes, or the set of nodes that are set up to be synchro or automatic or synchronous, so that to be considered as a successful transaction. So we could use this as a read-only secondary database. We can just go ahead and select yes. The same thing will be used here. We need to make sure whatever nodes that are be participating, make sure we set up the automatic failover, and we can select the read-only secondary here, yes. And the endpoints, it just tells us the different default port numbers, and and the endpoint name that are used here. And by default the encryption is set up, it uses a default self-signed certificate to be able to encrypt the data between the endpoints, and this is a service account. So we can use different service account. It's just need to be a domain account. So backup preference, basically you can set up the backup preference here. You can prefer secondary or secondary only, or primary or any replica. The listener, so this is an important step here. We need to make sure that the listener is properly set up, because that's how the clients actually connect to the database, and that's how it actually requests the routes to the actual node of the high availability group, depending upon the failover situation, or depending upon the type of request. So the listener DNS name I had already, so we can use this DNS name, and so none of this actually is set up actually, but this actually goes ahead and creates them. The port is 1433. We'll go ahead and add a static IP address. So let's make sure, yeah. So we'll click next. So everything is set up. We'll click next. So this is an important step here. Okay, we need to depending on what type of data synchronization preference are you going to be use, you know. So the first one is probably the best and the most easiest way. It depends upon the size of the database as well, so you need to carefully consider this before you actually start this rep process. What is your database what is your database size, and how would you like to be able to copy that backup of the database from the secondary node to how many ever nodes that you have configured as your secondary replicas to be able to restore on it. So the first option is full. So basically we use a network share. This could be anything as long as a SQL Server service account on all the nodes have access to it, to be able to read or write. So for example, the node that we are backing it from need to have read and write, but the nodes that we need to be backed up from, it just needs read only. So in this case, we'll use the one of the nodes backup location as a share, and being able to use that to be able to back up the data, or being able to use as our restore point, as a seed point. Basically it's we need to seed the backup to be able to start the high availability group. So join only is that basically the synchronization part is skipped, so it is actually left to the user to be able to make this process. So you back up the database manually, you restore it on the second node, and then you join the database. So in this case, we skip the initial data synchronization completely. Basically where the user has to do everything after the high availability group is set up. So let's go with the full, because that's the most easiest process. So what I did is I used the node, one of the node which is to be as our backup share. So if I go ahead and select this location, so there is already backup files in this, the backup that we just took right now. So I'm go ahead and delete this backup, actually delete the other backups here. So this is the backup that we just created right now, and this share is actually available, which I created. So basically how you do is you go to the database node, and wherever wherever the backup is stored, actually, so we locate the backup file location. In this case, I'm using, like I said, this is the lab setup. I'm using the backup location of the SQL instance. So what we do is we click select backup, and we make sure we share with specific users. So in this case, I had added the SQL admin, which is the SQL Server service account that I'm using for both the nodes here. And so how many ever SQL Server service accounts that you have for all the nodes, you just add them all and click share. So since I already did, I can do it again, it doesn't matter. So the folder is shared. So let's click here, and like I said, this is the backup file that is located. So with that completed, sorry, I'm switching too many computers here, but we are back to the high availability group setup. So we'll make sure we copy this location here for the synchronization part. So we click next. So here in this step, this goes ahead and validates. So you can see everything is green, so that's a good sign. So we have everything ready to be configured. So click next. So this is the entire summary of all the changes. We can actually go ahead and script out all the SQL SQL scripts that are actually set up, have been set up here to be able to use this process. I mean, to be able to use this process again if you want to. So it's always a good idea to back up the script to be able to document what changes were made to actually set up, and if you want to have a reference point as what went inside to the HA setup. So we'll go ahead and click finish. So during this process, it creates everything, it creates the availability group listener. It actually backs up the database from the node, to the second node, and it actually restores the database and it joins the availability. This is the most easiest way to do it. So if you're doing it for the first time, make sure you prefer a network shade join. So as you can see here, the wizard completes successfully. So we had completed we completed the high availability group here for the test database on both the nodes. So this is a good sign. So everything is success. Normally, if you skip the data synchronization process, you will be able to see that this result is actually none or skipped, because you wanted to be set up after the HA setup has completed. So we'll click close here, and let's create a new query here. So these are the two nodes. So let's go ahead and validate using the SQL manager. So you can see here the HA group and the availability database, and you can click here the availability group here, and everything is set up. You can actually see a dashboard that gives you a nice visual representation of your complete HA group setup. So here, this is the role here is secondary, and the failover mode is automatic, and failover readiness is no data loss. So if you fail over the database right now, there is no data loss will be incurred on your during the failover process. So this dashboard is accessible on both the nodes. So if you click on the primary node here, you can see that it identifies different nodes, different names, and the databases that are set up in this during in this high availability group, which is SQL HA03. So you can have multiple databases here. The only caveat is that when you select a database level health detection, the failover process involves all the databases in that group. Even though they don't share the disk that is actually creating the problem. So you need to be careful how you set up your groups. You need to think carefully and design properly to do this setup. So let's actually connect to it using our listener only. So we'll be using SQL HA03 to be able to connect to database directly, and you can see here we can connect to it using the availability group listener directly. Which is the best part of the HA, is that doesn't matter where your SQL Server service is actually currently available. It detects the available node and it actually connects to that node using the group listener. So if you want, we can quickly stop this instance, or this is our failover, this is our primary node. So we can trigger an automatic failover process. So what we'll do is we'll quickly go ahead and stop this instance. Yes. So that instance is stopped. So if you run a new query, okay, so the query that you have received, here the result is actually coming from the the failover node. So because it automatically detected the failover process, and it automatically routed your request to one of the other node. So what we'll do is I'm going to start this instance. Yes. So that actually, when I stopped the primary instance or primary node database, it actually detected the node is down, and the Windows failover cluster service has triggered the SQL Server to be able to fail over to the other node, or to be able to use the secondary replica as a primary node. So another way of doing is actually doing a if you go to the high availability group. So here this is called manual failover. So in this case, what we do is we actually trigger a manual failover process. Select the new primary replica. So we are on the 037, but we are going to the the other SQL node. So it says no data loss, and everything looks good. So for our for the failover process, so we'll click next. So we'll make sure we connect to it, click next, and finish. So here we are doing a manual failover to the secondary node. So it could be done in two ways, automatic and manual. So we just did both the ways. Okay, so that concludes our high availability group setup in Windows SQL 2017. If you have any questions related to this setup, please let me know. I'll be more than happy to help you to set up. And in the coming videos, maybe I'll actually set up the how to actually maybe I'll be able to show you guys how to actually set up the lab completely in using Windows 10 Hyper-V. So all the nodes here, I'm using Windows 10 Hyper-V to be set up all this. So I'm using Windows 10 host. So on my Windows 10 machine here, workstation, I had set up everything. So it's a fairly pretty easy process, but I'll be I'll be able to document and show you the next time how to do it. But until then, goodbye, and feel free to comment or like the video. Thanks.